The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon. The African Union, or AU, is in the midst of a long program to create an African economic community through the eventual merging of existing regional economic communities. U.S. policy is to support regional integration in Africa as enhancing the success of U.S.-Africa trade by reducing trade barriers and creating larger markets. This hearing will examine the AU effort and its potential benefits for Africa as well as the United States. A focal point in U.S.-Africa trade policy is the encouragement of integrated markets in Africa. It makes trade with Africa more efficient and beneficial for African business people as well as governments. It is also more attractive for foreign investors. The AU, a regional grouping of all countries except Morocco, was established in 2002 as a successor of the now defunct Organization of African Unity, or the OAU. Its formation was largely motivated by OAU members' desire to more quickly achieve the goals of the 1991 African Economic Community, which was signed by some 51 heads of state. The treaty is intended to promote African regional economic integration and socioeconomic development through the planned creation of a common African market and shared political and economic institutions. Make no mistake about it, this is a challenging goal. The example of the European community demonstrates the difficulty even when involving developing nations. The current African nations were not created to collaborate with one another. Varying languages, conflicting legal and commercial systems, often incompatible transportation infrastructures, make this worthy goal a major challenge, and there are other obstacles that make this effort even more daunting. Nevertheless, the 8 recognized regional economic communities have a timetable to which they are generally adherent to, with few exceptions. The Arab-Maghreb Union, a trade agreement comprising Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, and Tunisia, is inactive and frozen due to deep political and economic disagreements between Morocco and Algeria regarding, among other issues, the matter of Western Sahara independence. The community of Saharan states, comprising 28 countries across Africa's Sahel region, is finding regional integration difficult because of its members being part of other trade blocs that are more advanced in their integration. Meanwhile, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, a free trade area with 19 member states stretching from Libya to Swaziland, has agreed to an expanded free trade zone and is also considering a visa scheme to boost tourism. The East African Community, an intergovernmental organization comprising some 5 East African countries, Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda, signed a protocol just last year outlining their plans for launching a monetary union within 10 years. The Economic Community of Central African States, which includes 10 countries across the middle of the continent, formed a customs union with a free trade area between members and a common external tariff for imports from other countries as long ago as 1966. The Economic Community of West African States, a regional group of 15 West African countries, is creating a single large trading bloc through an economic and trading union and serves as peacekeeping force in the region, all despite operating officially with 3 co-equal languages, French, English, and Portuguese. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development is an 8-country trading bloc based in East Africa and has transformed from an executive group with a focus on development and environment control to a larger structure as a regional economic community. The Southern African Development Community began as an anti-apartheid coalition fighting for majority rule in South Africa in the 1970s, but since majority rule came to South Africa in 1994, since it came there, it has become a traditional regional economic community, and like its West African counterpart, sometimes engages in peacekeeping operations. By 2017, a free trade union and customs union is supposed to be established in each regional economic community. The process is still stalled in North Africa and the Sahel, although there is progress elsewhere. This phase is now fully enforced in East Africa as well as West and Central Africa. In today's hearing, we are looking for recommendations on what the regional economic communities and their member countries must do to fulfill the AU's ambitious agenda. But we also want to examine what the U.S. government, other donor governments, and international financial institutions can do to enhance their efforts in this regard. Ostensibly, this assistance has been ongoing for some time now. We want to find out more about these efforts, and why they have not moved further ahead. We have with us an extraordinary panel of experts who have observed regional integration in Africa and in some cases have worked to promote it for more than a decade. We know what governments have said about the benefits of regional integration, and we have heard from the private sector about their preference for integrated markets. Today we want to hear from some who can provide and have provided the technical assistance necessary to make these goals a reality. We in Congress are currently working on legislation to extend the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, and integrated regional markets will only enhance the success of this trade process moving forward. We hope today's contributions will better inform us on how we can be more effectively engaged in regional integration and the expansion of African markets. I now yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, the Ranking Member.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Happy New Year. And I want to thank you, as always, for your leadership in holding today's hearing, which is raising the question, will there be an African economic community? This is a very important question as it relates to Africa's economic development, and it is critical that we familiarize ourselves with the strategic roles played by the African Union, its Commission, member states, and individual regional economic communities regarding regional economic integration. As early as 1991, the African Union addressed this issue by identifying regional economic integration as crucial to Africa's social economic development, self-sufficiency, and financial prowess. The AU's Commission prioritization of this issue and the commitment of AU member states and the RECs to support this effort was underscored at the 50th Summit of the AU last May, which I had the honor of attending. Last September, in a keynote address at the Congressional Black Caucus's Brain Trust here in Washington, D.C., AU Chairperson Dr. Zuma emphasized the importance of regional economic integration and stressed that achieving this goal would be socio-economically transformative for Africa. As a strong supporter of increased trade and investment between Africa and the U.S., a component of which is the reauthorization and strengthening of AGOA, I believe or applaud the AU's objective of regional economic integration. I believe the growth in business and investment between the U.S. and African private sectors is a win-win scenario which can ultimately expand the growing service sector and contribute to capacity building on the continent. It can also develop an increasing customer base for U.S. business comprised of a growing African middle class, trends which develop and secure jobs in Africa and the U.S. The U.S. government initiatives such as Power Africa, Trade Africa, AGOA, and Doing Business in Africa help to build trade and investment partnerships between the U.S. and Africa by focusing increasingly on partnerships with the private sector, the involvement of civil society in Africa, as well as the diaspora community. Feed the Future contributes to developing Africa's agricultural sector and promoting food security. The success of the latter is particularly noteworthy this year as the AU has identified 2014 as the year of agriculture and food security. These government initiatives increasingly work on a whole-of-government basis and contribute to growth in key sectors of individual African countries and regions. Over the past few years, we have witnessed increased AU member states' commitment to the greater goal of intra-African trade promoted by the realization that old barriers to trade must be eradicated in favor of less complicated, commerce-enhancing alternatives. We have also seen several African countries identified by the international financial institutions as having the fastest growing economies worldwide, especially given the reversal of the brain drain, record levels of remittances from hardworking and successful diaspora communities, and the expansion of middle-class consumerism. Africa is viewed as a good investment by several of our economic competitors. While this progress is commendable, African and American economists and observers stress that much more needs to be done to address ongoing infrastructural and capacity building challenges faced by many African countries, particularly those dependent on the agricultural sector. Uneven income distribution, price subsidies, poor transportation networks and infrastructure, rampant unemployment and underemployment of young people, poor access to electrical power, and frankly, a greater need for good governance has resulted in a pattern of uneven economic development across individual countries and regions. Against this backdrop, I welcome our witnesses here today. I'm very interested in hearing from them about how the AU, the RECs, and individual countries plan to address these challenges. Secondly, as the U.S. seeks to strengthen trade and investment relations with Africa, what role should U.S. embassies play in the process? And while AGOA has been very successful in increasing U.S.-Africa trade in oil and textile industries, which has limited job creation, frankly, there has been little success in exporting other AGOA-eligible products to the U.S. that could be produced by small to medium-sized companies. Are AGOA-eligible countries developing strategies to increase exports of goods produced by SMEs? And finally, in view of the current situation in South Sudan, how does the EAC address Juba's application for EAC membership? As I've said in previous hearings, we learn as much from our success as we do from our failures. As we hear from today's witnesses, our focus should not only cover the broad diversity of success and the many challenges, but the activities that worked well in addition to those that fail to accomplish their objectives. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Mr. Marino? Mr. Cicilline?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Bass, for holding today's hearing on this very important issue. I'd like to offer my gratitude to the witnesses for their testimony and, more importantly, for the important work that they're doing. As one of the most resource-rich regions on the planet, Africa has always possessed tremendous economic potential. And while the 8 regional economic communities in Africa develop closer ties and foster greater cooperation, the world will be watching attentively. It's imperative that the United States remain a strong trading partner with nations on the African continent throughout this process, and as Congresswoman Bass said, learn both from the successes as well as the failures. As regional integration improves, the African trading position and economy in general will improve, and I hope that we will see a correlating reduction in terrorism and political unrest in the region. I again thank the witnesses for their testimony and look forward to hearing the testimony today. Yield back.
Mr. Weber? I'm good. And Dr. Burr? I'd like to now welcome our distinguished witnesses to the panel, to the witness table, beginning first of all with Dr. Amadou Sy, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Africa Growth Initiative and currently serves as a member of the editorial board of the Global Credit Review. He focuses on banking, capital markets, and macroeconomics in Africa and emerging markets. Dr. Sy was previously Deputy Division Chief of the Financial Service Division of the International Monetary Fund's Monetary and Capital Markets Development. And Dr. Sy has also held a variety of positions at the IMF for the last 15 years, covering more than 20 countries in all the financial crises since 1998. He also worked on a project to set up a trust fund for capacity building in Africa. We then will hear from Mr. Stephen Landy, who is over his 50-year career at the State Department, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and in private sector. Mr. Landy has worked extensively to expand U.S. trade. He has worked as a Foreign Service officer, senior trade negotiator, and an assistant U.S. trade representative. He has negotiated trade agreements with countries around the world, and he was instrumental in the creation of the Generalized System of Preferences, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, and NAFTA. Mr. Landy continues to work with African governments and teaches international trade at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Well, we then hear from Dr. Peter Korte, who is Associate Professor in Development Economics at the University of Ghana. He was formerly the Deputy Director of the Center for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana. He is also currently the Board Chairman of the University of Ghana's Cooperative Credit Union. He has published extensively, and his research interests are private sector development, including small and medium enterprises, development finance, migration and remittances, and poverty analyses. He consults for the World Bank, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Overseas Development Institute, and many others. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Whitney Schneidman, of Covington and Burling and the Brookings Institution. She is a senior international Advisor for Africa at Covington and Burling. Dr. Scheidman, a non-lawyer, has a deep understanding of many of the major African countries, as well as uniquely valuable insights into the recurrent challenges and opportunities across the continent. He provides strategic advice on the varied political, economic, social, and regulatory issues that are critical to companies' success in Africa. Dr. Schneidman's work focuses on U.S.-Africa relations, trade and investment in sub-Saharan Africa, and issues related to economic growth and regional integration on the continent. So, Doctor, thank you as well. We'll begin with you, Dr. C.
Okay. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for convening this important hearing to discuss Africa's progress towards establishing an economic community. I appreciate the invitation to share my views on behalf of the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution. The following views are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Brookings Institution. Mr. Chairman, hoping for their countries to benefit from integration, 51 African leaders signed the Abuja Treaty in 1991 and established a roadmap towards an African economic community to be completed by 2028. Mr. Chairman, 23 years later, regional integration is happening across Africa, but progress is happening at different speeds. The 8 building blocks of the treaty, the regional economic communities, have different levels of advancement across the components of regional integration, such as freedom of movement for capital and goods, labor mobility, and unification of currencies. Simply put, 4 RECs are measurably progressing at regional integration, and 4 are falling behind. As of 2013, the East African community appears to have made the most progress overall towards the stages of the Abuja Treaty. Even within regional groupings, the progress of individual countries towards achieving convergence target is uneven. The diversity of countries within the same regional bloc is at times very pronounced. For instance, the Central African Republic is the only non-oil exporting country in the economic community of Central States. In South Sudan, a member of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, the humanitarian, political, and economic situation is deteriorating very rapidly. There is also significant overlap of membership between RECs. This is a problem because countries belonging to more than one regional bloc can find it difficult to prioritize their policies. Mr. Chairman, African governments will need to address a number of challenges to accelerate integration. They will need to maintain regional peace and security, strengthen common institutions, and streamline regional integration policies. Mr. Chairman, increased African regional integration would create larger markets, improve economies of scale, and reduce transaction costs for local, regional, and global trade. Greater US exports to Africa will create more jobs on this side of the Atlantic, as well as on the other side. And as you know, there are ongoing efforts by the United States to support regional integration. In order for the US to help support regional integration in Africa, I suggest deepened engagement. Mr. Chairman, I would recommend the following 3 actions to support regional integration. Number 1, broaden the Trade Africa initiative to other RECs. Trade Africa so far focuses only on the East African community, and there is merit in expanding it quickly to other RECs. At a minimum, and pending their inclusion in the program, these RECs could build capacity by adapting to the harmonization standards being associated to the initiative. A roadmap for these RECs to join the initiative could be established. Number 2, expand the Power Africa initiative to include regional projects. Power Africa so far focuses only on 6 countries. The initiative could coordinate with regional and continental initiatives to address the power deficit in the continent. This is important since regional projects could benefit from economies of scale and lay the basis for a regional energy market. Finally, number 3, strengthen REC's secretariats and commissions. Building strong institutions would help lay the basis for faster and better quality economic integration and potentially for monetary integration. The US could coordinate with the African Union and the RECs to encourage multilateral institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank Group to step up their support to regional integration in Africa. Since African nations lack representation in these global governance institutions, support from the US and on the multilaterals could greatly increase support for RECs. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for convening this important meeting.
Dr. C, thank you very much for your testimony, and without objection, your full statement and that of all of our distinguished witnesses will be made a part of the record, and any additional documentation or statements you'd like to have added to your text. Mr. Lundy.
When I hear my description, sometimes I think I should be speaking before the History Channel as opposed to such an august body, but I very much appreciate that, and hopefully some of my experience can be useful in terms of our discussion. Many people say that Africa is moving too slowly towards regional integration. May I remind you that the European Union started their efforts at regional integration in 1951 with the European Coal and Steel Community, from which they developed additional members and groups. But it was not until 1992, which the way I subtract 41 years later, that they really arrived at something that could be called a customs union, and so on, or something that we called a customs union. Africa has been the game, as pointed out by Mr. C, since 1994, when the Abuja Treaty was implemented, and it is hoped that they will arrive at this particular milestone of a customs union by 2017. And even if it slips it through a couple of years, that's less than 30 years. So people should remember these are complicated things. Europe had a lot of advantages. They had trade. They had a history of being countries. They had a whole group of commerce that went on for years and years. They had an infrastructure project proposal. So one should not push too quickly. I could not believe the timing of this hearing. It was almost like people were listening in Africa and saying, we better show something in terms of regional integration. So there have been two significant developments in terms of moving towards free trade agreements. Number one, the ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, at an October 16th extraordinary summit, reaffirmed their decision that their free trade agreement and customs union both will become operational as of January 1st, 2015. This will bring together, as pointed out in your comments, the Francophone, the Lusophone, the Anglophone, all kinds of different systems, Roman systems, common law systems. I cannot tell you all the solace and problems you had in putting something like this together, but this is quite an achievement. Similarly, the tripartite group, which combines the three regional economic communities in Eastern and Southern Africa and so on, they are planning to make operational by June 2014 their free trade agreement. And then they have plans to further deepen with things in services, things in common customs procedures, and so on. These are things that are moving along. You can talk about 8 RECs, but let's be very honest. We're talking about 5 that really count in this exercise. Central Africa is going a little bit slower. We have to figure out whether they continue alone, whether they join ECOWAS because they're all mainly French-speaking or not. Some Central African countries, such as Burundi, Rwanda, the Congo, Angola, have already chosen to work within the tripartite group. So they are open. The Union of Arab States, the UMA, Union of Maghreb, Arab Maghreb Union, is not really moving in much direction, so I don't discuss them. I focus on sub-Saharan Africa to see where we are headed and so on, et cetera. The U.S. should be very proud of the role it's played because we, ahead of any other countries, even ahead of the European Union, really began pushing regional integration back in the 1990s. We were the original sponsors in many ways of COMESA. We were the original supporters of ECOWAS and so on. Today, there are many things we do, whether they are the regional hubs, which have been very effective operating in this particular environment. USTR has trade and information framework agreements with almost each one of the regional economic communities in place and so on. The State Department has appointed ambassadors to each of the regional communities. So we should have a good feeling because of this particular project that is going on. The advantages, really quickly put, are, one, you have a much stronger fabric for political democracy, for maintaining good government if you do have a regional economic communities. You have a lot more peer pressure to get that done. American companies need regional economic communities because American companies are too big to operate within 49 or 54 countries within Africa. They need that scope in order to develop. So this is a very important to be part of the economies of scale and to include Africa within its own supply chains and end this annoying reliance on the Far East, and you know what that means without mentioning any countries' names and so on. The African countries need them because of infrastructure. As Donald Kaberka, the president of the African Development Bank, suggested that infrastructure projects must go beyond national borders, and it's pretty obvious that they really must, so that's the third reason. And the fourth was mentioned by one of the real icons of trade policy, Fred Berkson, who recently retired as head of the Institute of International Economics, who said, listen, no one's going to listen to 49 countries in trade negotiations, 54 countries. You may call them cheaters. They're not cheaters, they're small. But if they were unified, people would listen to them. So from that interest, too, it's important in terms of negotiation. So there is, no one makes any argument I've never heard against regional integration. It's the one area everyone can agree on. Run through very quickly and so on. Make one other point. No one says that trade negotiations by themselves are going to get economic development. They are what we call a necessary but not a sufficient for growth. You must have a complementary measures. And in this case, I really must compliment the chairman and the ranking members of this committee, as well as any other committee with a significant involvement in Africa in this Congress. Foreign Ways and Means Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the Senate Finance Committee, because you guys put together an unbelievable request for information to the GAO. And it goes beyond simple trade matters. So you must look at AGOA as establishing the conditions, but not, of a trade, establishing the conditions, but not assuring the free flow of goods. For that, you have to have the infrastructure development, you have to have the capacity building, you have to have the rule of law. And your letter begins to address that. So we very much support this coordinated venture, and we hope it does continue and so on. Can I have an extra minute? Thank you. And I won't be that New York trick of just talking faster so no one knows a word you're saying, so I will take a breath and slow up.
Take two then.
Let me just run through very quickly 8 suggestions that might be useful, because that's why you go to hearings, to make suggestions and so on. You need the seamless renewal, and let me emphasize, of a strengthened AGOA. Simply renewing AGOA by itself is not sufficient. We have a challenge. It takes time to put together an enhanced AGOA. We have a deadline called textiles, where people want that to be enacted very quickly, because if you do not enact it 6-7 months before the program expires, you lose orders. So there seems to be work. I'm an optimist, and I really believe that given the the bipartisan nature of Africa as represented here, maybe we could get something finished this year. I won't say we can't, but I want to have it strengthened, enhanced, and related to other policies and so on, which is extremely important. We must address some of the agricultural issues, for example. Makes no sense not to have ground nuts, sugar, and so on in there. Number 2, very quickly, let's think about empowering RECs in a new and unique way. Why don't we think about designating regional economic communities for eligibility under AGOA instead of individual countries? If regional economic communities want to take on the responsibility of assuring that U.S. conditions are met for democracy, let's do that. Number 3, you have to look at conditionalities in general. The idea, for example, no one likes what goes on in the Congo. But the idea of passing a conflict mineral law that only helps China and Japan, that adds $6 billion to the cost of U.S. companies doing business in Africa, throws people out of work in the very areas we're trying to get stability, doesn't make sense. So we have to come up with a much more targeted area for many of the things we do, recognizing that we must work with African peer groups and with other donors. Unilateral U.S. actions should only be taken as an absolutely last resort. The biggest threat to regional integration is our friends in Europe. They are pushing for preferential access by threatening to close the market to African goods while we continue AGOA that will not only harm U.S. exports in the most vibrant and fastest growing market of the world, but will also but will also slow up African integration. Ethiopia is not in a mood at the moment to open up for Africa, for Europe. Maybe Kenya will be forced to, but they export a lot of products. How do you form a customs union if your major supplier, Ethiopia, has MFN duties, and if Kenya is giving them zero duty? We are urging that perhaps working quietly with Congress, your parliamentary groups, talking to USTR, remembering the TTIP must be approved here, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Promotion Agreement. We just suggest that a little bit of discussion maybe may have the Europeans slow up their deadline. They have an arbitrary date, July 2014. Couldn't be worse for AGOA, but we can deal with that. Number 5, South Africa, real challenge. They have a deal with Europe where we're being discriminated against. They don't have a deal with us. We're urging that we look at this issue very carefully. We don't think South Africa should be graduated. We do think U.S. exports should be protected. We have the best USTR in years sitting there now. I think he can deal with this challenge in some kind of a way. It has to be addressed one way or the other and so on. Number 6, going very quickly, that we, and I agree with the point that was just made, that the OPEC, the MCC have to have regional programs. My partner, Tony Carroll, suggested before this body about 2 years ago that maybe we should suggest to MCC that 20% of their funding goes for regional projects along the way and so on. And again, the similar point on Trade Africa we think is very good. We know it talks about focusing first on East Africa, then looking at other regions. We think that it should really begin to look at other regions now, particularly the type of support that U.S. aid can give to get these negotiations finished. So in short, what we are saying is that with the exception of a challenge in Central Africa, Africa has a schedule. That schedule calls for 2017 free trade, 2019 customs union. They may slip a few years, but they're going to make it. We must make sure that our policies support that, and that is done through a program that has foreign aid, that has support of private sector, everybody on a regional level, and recognizes the fact that AGOA should be renewed in its current form, but it should aim for reciprocity, but at the time that Africa is unified to negotiate as a group. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I speeded up a drop, but your smiles indicated that it was not being wasted. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. And after 50 years of experience, the few extra minutes were well worth it. Thank you, Mr. Landy. Dr. Quarti.
Chairman Chris Smith and honorable members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to share my views on whether there can be an African regional community with a specific focus on ECOWAS. I approach this topic based on my 10 years professional experience. Although I work with one of the leading think tanks in Africa, the views expressed here are entirely mine. Mr. Chairman, in addressing the question whether there can be a regional economic community in Africa, I would like to focus on the achievements and challenges of ECOWAS, and hopefully this would inform the discussion on whether an Africa-wide community is feasible. ECOWAS, as some of you may know, has created a number of benefits to its member states, including first, the maintenance of peace and security in the region, whereby the community serves as a peacekeeping force in the region. Secondly, the promotion of free movement of people and goods between member states, and examples of this includes 90 days visa-free entry for members, the ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Scheme and Customs Union. Mr. Chairman, also the integration of the agricultural base to promote food security is one of the achievements of ECOWAS, where we can make mention of the ECOWAS Common Agricultural Policy, which was instituted in 2005. We can also talk of the West African Common Industrial Policy. Creating a favorable business environment is also one of the achievements. We have what we term the ECOWAS Business Council, which is a regional private sector advisory body to ECOWAS policy makers. Reducing the procedures for registering a business, the number of days required to register a business, and reducing the cost of doing business dramatically have been one of the other achievements. Mr. Chairman, another achievement includes the measures to improve the fiscal infrastructure and some specific examples are the Regional Trade Facilitation Program, where member states improve the road network linking other member states. We can also talk of the West African Gas Pipeline Project, and as well as the West African Power Pool Project, where power will be shared between energy deficit and energy surplus member states. Mr. Chairman, I would at this point outline some of the challenges facing ECOWAS. First, there are threats to regional peace and security due to political instability and internal conflicts. Secondly, the monetary integration is far-fetched, as the 6 member states have been unable to meet the convergence criteria. The lack of well-structured and resourced institutions have also affected the operations of ECOWAS. Limited financial resources, as well as impediments to trade and cases of harassment at the various borders continue to operate. The high cost of business among member states is also reported as one of the challenges faced by the ECOWAS community. The Doing Business report, for instance, ranked Ghana 128 out of 189 countries. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, the poor cross-border infrastructure and weak institutional and human capacity has affected the operations of ECOWAS. So based on the achievements and challenges outlined above, Mr. Chairman, I am of the conviction that achieving an African regional community is possible, but that is an uphill task. Promoting integration in Africa will bring enormous benefit to the region as well as to the region's partners. Integration, in short, would help Africa better police itself. The United States will stand to benefit from the collective fight against instability and terrorism if we promote regional communities in Africa. Also, Mr. Chairman, US firms already in the region and potential ones who have a business environment to operate and secure their investment. The AGWA initiative, as well as other initiatives of the USAID West African Trade Hub, are better able to facilitate businesses in the sub-region and access US markets with greater integration. Mr. Chairman, integration would enhance the size of the African market, and US companies already operating in the region can expand output and employ more people, including Americans. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, promoting regional integration will enhance the regional markets of African countries, would promote trade in the region, and facilitate peace and security. But this will require the support of the international community, especially the United States. Thank you very much.
Dr. Corti, thank you very much for your testimony. Now, Dr. Scheidman.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to address the question, will there be an African economic community? It is not possible to know precisely when or even if the 8 regional economic communities that are recognized by the African Union will fully integrate into one. After all, the Abuja Treaty of 1991 envisioned the establishment of an African economic community by 2028. More recently, in January 2012, African heads of state committed to the creation of a continental free trade area by 2017, although the date was described as indicative. The decision by the African leaders to bring forward by 11 years the date for the continent's economic integration is nevertheless important. It demonstrates that regional, commercial, and economic integration is a priority for the governments across the region. The accelerated date is also a recognition that the emergence of regional markets is central to Africa's integration into the global economy and ultimately the acceleration of job creation and improvement in the quality of life and the eradication of poverty across the continent. It is also a recognition of the reality that greater integration will enhance efficiency and transparency and strengthen governance more broadly. In fundamental respects, therefore, an African economic community is both an aspiration and a tangible goal that is essential to work toward. Therefore, dates such as 2017 are not as important as is our focus on the progress or lack thereof that is being made toward the development of regional markets and the free flow of goods, peoples, and services. So where are we in this process? It is apparent that progress toward regional markets is being made. However, like other trends on the African continent, progress is incremental, in many cases measurable, but it is not uniform. For example, the 3 regional organizations of North Africa have yet to harmonize activities and progressively eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers. This was supposed to have been completed in 2007, according to the Abuja Treaty. In contrast, the East African Community is the only regional economic community to have achieved a free trade area and a customs union among its 5 members, 3 years ahead of the 2017 date provided by the Abuja Treaty. Moreover, the East African Community, the Common Market for East and Southern Africa, COMESA, and the Southern African Development Community, SADC, have created a tripartite free trade area which brings together 26 African countries with a combined population of 600 million and a GDP that is close to $1 trillion. However, further steps have to be taken to ensure that the FTA is a reality. For example, an American businessman recently told me that he would rather pay the extra duty in shipping his goods from one SADC country to another rather than go through the paperwork and other delays of applying for tariff exemptions for which his products qualified. Against this backdrop, it is unlikely that a continental free trade area will be achieved by 2017. Nevertheless, there can be no dispute about the importance of continuing to work towards these objectives. For example, a recent study by the ILO and UNCTAD contends that if an effective continental free trade area were created by 2017, the share of intra-Africa trade would grow by 52% over a 12-year period, rising from 10.2% in 2012 to 15.5% in 2022. The message here is that the impact of regional integration on individual countries, regions, and sectors varies. Another message is that where progress on regional integration can be achieved, it should be pursued. At the same time, this does not mean we should give up on the goal of a continental free trade area. There is no region in the world where progress is uniform. It does suggest that African governments should be held accountable to their commitment to implement trade reforms and regional economic integration. For example, 4 years ago, the governments of Zimbabwe and Zambia signed an MOU to create a one-stop border post at Chirundu on the border between the 2 countries. As a result, commercial vehicles now clear the border within hours instead of days. In fact, on the Zambia side alone, it's been estimated that tax collection has increased from $10 million to $20.3 million a month. So one has to ask, why are there not more one-stop border posts throughout SADC, COMESA, and EAC? Finally, it's important to note that in the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa that the Obama administration released in 2012 promoting regional integration is put forward as a priority. In fact, through Trade Africa, an initiative announced during President Obama's visit to Tanzania last year, the administration hopes to launch negotiations on an investment treaty between the U.S. and the East African community. This is a vital initiative that could significantly deepen commercial relations with East Africa and lay the groundwork for a deeper commercial relationship with the continent while also fostering more regional integration. In Bali last month, members of the WTO reached a very significant agreement on trade facilitation in which member states agreed to adopt reforms, especially as it concerns customs processes and procedures. The U.S. needs to ensure that enhanced trade facilitation remains a priority in its dialogue with its partners on the continent, be it in the context of the East African investment negotiations or the implementation of AGOA. My last point, if I may, reflects the spirited conversation that I had in late December with the leaders of our 3 trade hubs from Accra, Nairobi, and Botswana, which are sponsored by USAID. For the last 10 years, their role has been to help African companies take advantage of AGOA. Yet times are changing as impressive economic growth takes hold across the continent and Africa's middle class continues to expand. U.S. exports to the region also continued to grow, last year exceeding $21 billion, which translates into the support for more than 100,000 jobs here in the United States. Our trade hubs increasingly are playing a critical role in facilitating two-way trade. This is good for American business in Africa, it is good for regional integration, and it is good for economic development on the continent. It also helps to transform the U.S.-African relationship from that of donor-recipient to one characterized by partnership and mutual benefit. Yet, like all good things, resources are required. I urge you, therefore, to invest in these trade hubs as you and your colleagues work to fund U.S. priorities on the continent, and we all work together to deepen the U.S.-Africa commercial relationship and build Africa's economic community. Thank you.
Dr. Steinman, thank you very much for your testimony as well. Very useful and very timely suggestions from all of you, and it really will help us to be more proactive and to play our role, which we are very earnest to do. And thank you so much for taking the time to put together such outstanding testimony and for your service on behalf of humanity and on behalf of these initiatives in particular. Let me ask you just a few questions, and I'll yield to my colleagues. We will expect to vote in about 45 minutes, so I want to make sure, since we have 4 or 5 of us here today, that we all get a chance to ask. So I'll lay out my questions and then ask you to answer, and then go to my friend and colleague, Karen Bass. With regards to the efforts by the United States government to encourage regional integration, what programs have actually made a measurable difference? Are there things that we have not done? I know, Mr. Landy, you gave us a list of some 8 specific things, and I wrote them down, and I'm sure all of us will be looking at how we can, but any gaps that need to be filled right now to ensure the greater probability of success? The issue of transportation is always a very important, I mean, it was Eisenhower who recognized that superhighways were one of the keys, a very robust infrastructure to creating highways to get goods to market and to consumers. Over the many years, you, Mr. Landy, have promoted the use of the Regional Millennium Challenge Account grants, only to be told that those grants require more accountability than the regional economic community could provide. And I wonder if you're seeing any kind of benign flexibility on the part of the Millennium Challenge to try to make this work, so that, again, the sooner we get to the point where there's a very robust infrastructure, economic growth can proceed much more effectively. With regards to the rollout, you know, the European Union, we all watched with some bated breath as the euro came online, and it was a mistake after mistake. Are those lessons learned by what has happened on the European continent being utilized in this context of Africa? And Mr. Schneiderman, you pointed out that reaching the target date of 2017 is important, but we need to recognize progress itself. It may slip a few years. My question would be a couple of things. One, you mentioned that the U.S. regional trade hubs in Africa managed by the U.S. Agency for International Development have had a positive impact, and you encourage Congress to continue funding them, which I think is a, you know, the budget's almost done, and I think it's going to happen. But can you cite some examples of success that these trade hubs have achieved, so that we have something very tangible that we can talk about? Please proceed. Dr. C.
If I may answer the questions on the lessons from the European crisis, I think one key lesson from the European crisis is that financial integration comes with costs and benefits. In most African RECs, we are not yet at that level of high financial integration. But the key lessons is that once that step will be reached, to make sure that when financial flows from rich countries go to poor countries, that those flows go to productive investments, they increase productivity, and that also fiscal discipline is observed by the members. So far, we can, in the roadmap, when we are strengthening the institutions integration, keep these lessons in mind.
Is there a concern, Dr. C, that like in the European Union, like in the case of the Germans and others who were providing a great deal of financial assistance to places like Greece, that Nigeria and South Africa might be less forthcoming in this whole integration process if they think they're going to bear a burden?
Yes, so this is a good question because if you take the case of Nigeria, it's a major oil exporter, whereas other members in the REX are not oil exporters. Nigeria is much larger. So when there will be basically an arbitrage between the costs and the benefits of actions by Nigeria, there will be the need to have a very strong and independent common central bank. So strengthening the institutions, the regional institutions, will be really key, and there will be also a need for Nigeria to have more fiscal discipline too. Thank you.
Mr. Ladd.
Thank you. Let me respond to a few of them and see if we can be helpful.
Okay.
First, as to what the U.S. government can do, and so on. One, it is very clear to me that there are two separate levels of regional integration. One is what you call the trade regime. We talk about a lot with tariffs. We made the point that they're moving along very nicely. However, there's never any credit given to Africa. It's always, to quote one of the best USTRs we ever had, Bob Strauss, years ago, and so on, when he said, you can either look at the glass half full or half empty. And these particular dates, the fact that they're set, should receive something, maybe a sense of Congress. I'm not sure what you would do, but at least they should be recognized they're moving along. The idea that every single REC is going to be ready for integration by 2017 won't take place. But what I was arguing was if you focus on the trade policy RECs, if you get ECOWAS, Central Africa, somehow involved, you'll have a shot at making the deadline, maybe some kind of a derogation for the Maghreb, and they're not the same close integration, so they're possible there. Trade involves four things. One, tariffs. Trade facilitation. Whitney is 100% correct, and let's focus on it. We now have World Bank money committed, available to promote trade facilitation. Africa's invited to sign those agreements. A quick aside, they have no role for regional economic communities, so they should have one, but that's sitting there. Number three is rules of origin is being addressed. And number four, very quickly, are non-tariff measures. They're impossible. You know, we even have non-tariff measures in the States. You try to bring some fruit into California, and I think Congressman Bass might remember that. You know, the Europeans, you try to bring some French wine into Italy or Italian wine into France. I mean, it looks like blood on the street. So non-tariff measures are slow. Do not judge regional integration. They have to be removed like teeth, one by one, with a lot of pain every time they disappear. Maybe you don't want to remove your teeth. But that's trade, I think, is on a good thing. Then the second thing is, how do you do the gaps? Don't judge African integration because they don't have a transportation link. They'll have that. Let's get the structure. Here again, MCC has a problem. Export-Import Bank has a problem because their basic rules call for assurance of capital support, that money will be paid back. None of our competitors have that when it comes to Africa. Africa will pay back. Africa pays 19%, a much higher rate, but they have more losses. So somebody has to begin going to Export-Import Bank. Somebody has to begin going to MCC and say, we need special purpose vehicles, because we're talking about regional things. You may have to take a little more risk in Africa. That's why your letter is so crucial, because you asked that question, the 8 committees. Maybe we have to get financial services in there, but if you could begin to address those problems, what are our competitors doing, what are we doing, we can make some progress along the way. Africans have said transportation, energy, capital markets, welcoming environment for investment, 2 or 3 other things. Yes, they have to be looked at, but let's keep those issues separate from the trade regimes that we are really working on to move forward and so on. Let me stop there because I can go on, but I think there's time and other people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would just want to focus on the MCA, the Millennium Challenge account, and to what extent is the U.S. intervention making a marked difference. Two specific areas can be mentioned in the case of Ghana. One is we have the George Walker Bush Highway, one of the excellent road construction that the country has benefited. It has eased trade flows, it has eased traffic, and it's made livelihoods much better within the community. Then we can talk of storage out of the Millennium Challenger Compact. There was a silo that was built at the airport to store non-traditional exports like pineapple, pawpaw, and many others. And it's quite important. It made a lot of improvements in exports to Europe and other places. Lastly, good governance. I mean, the condition that there has to be good governance for countries to benefit from the compact actually serves as a peer pressure to other African countries to try to promote good governance within the country. So I think these are areas that we can talk of tremendous improvement. What we want to see would be long-term commitment to some of these projects that is not, the compacts are more integrated into long-term development plans of the regional communities so that we'll see much more development that will also link the various member states of the regional countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me respond to some of these questions. What programs have actually made a difference? I think there have been a number of programs that have focused on computerizing border crossings, programs that I would say are incremental. What we haven't seen is transformational programs. And I think that's the critical difference. And I think, for instance, in my testimony, I referred to the one-stop border post. And so I think the challenge in front of us is how do we get behind one program that really will be transformational, and how do we set goals? So in 5 years, we know that there'll be 40 of these one-stop border posts throughout this region, and we can measure the difference that it makes. Secondly, I'm very interested in your reference to President Eisenhower and the development of our highway network. It's a very important question and analogy, but remember, that was within one country. I think what we're talking about is cross-border, and there comes the sovereignty issue. The World Bank has had a very difficult problem with this. You can take the example of Tanzania, which has received an $850 million compact. But Kenya is not an MCC country. Uganda is not an MCC country. So there are constraints. And so I think what Steve was referring to, can we be creative? Can Congress and the administration come up with mechanisms and criteria that would enable these programs to address cross-border roads or cross-border rails or cross-border power and utility services? I think that really has to be part of our conversation. In terms of the lessons of the euro, I think the European experience is being overshadowed, frankly, by these economic partnership agreements, which the EU is trying to jam down the throat of many African governments. I don't think there's any other way to put it than that. And I think, Africa is really struggling to come to terms with that, and that's all they can see. And it's a really important issue for the U.S. as we go to think about the renewal of AGOA as well. And in terms of citing examples of the trade hubs, with my colleague Xenia Lewis at Brookings, we did a study in 2012 where we have data on the amount of trade that has been increased, and I'll make sure that you get a copy of that. Suffice to say that these trade hubs are important. Not only have they've increased trade, but some of them have done something else that is important. In West Africa, the trade hub is sort of a backbone for a framework of trade initiatives that reach out through the region. And I think they've provided a blueprint for the way forward, a way forward to deepen our knowledge of African markets, our access to African markets, and to start providing two-way assistance, not only for Africans exporting to the U.S., but for U.S. companies coming into the regional market.
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to continue on with the trade hubs. And you mentioned that more investment was needed, and I wanted to know what you meant by that. And then also, if you could, the trade hubs to me are a little bit of a mystery. In looking at some of them and seeing that USAID essentially has contracted with businesses, it's just not clear to me exactly what they do, what they are, and maybe you could focus on one specific example.
So the trade hubs were created with the African Growth and Opportunity Act,
Right.
and they're part of the funding mechanism. There are three, as you know, and as I referred to. Part of the problem is that up until now, you're right, they've contracted out to different consulting agencies. And the trade hubs are doing three different things, really. There's not a uniform, up until now, there has not been a uniform strategy for these hubs. I think that's changing, but it bears watching very closely. The reason I say that it deserves more investment is that traditionally investments in the economic and commercial programs in Africa are at the bottom of the barrel. Obviously, health has been a critical factor. Education's been a critical factor. But again, times are changing, and I think we need a fresh look. And we have to ask, do we need to invest more in our capacity to serve American business on the continent? And I would argue that we do, for many reasons. First off, when you look at China, they have some 150 commercial officers across the continent. How many do we have? I don't even think it's at 10 these days. So what's the forward point of our commercial engagement? It's these trade hubs. Commerce has sort of receded from a presence in the region over the last decade, and the trade hubs provide a framework for serving U.S. business, for continuing to work with African companies as they seek to trade throughout the African region and export to the U.S. And I think the Foreign Service nationals there who work in these trade hubs know these markets better than anybody else, and I think are a real resource that can be tapped into. And that's why I emphasize it.
So if I go to an embassy, there's a sign there that says Trade Hub,
No.
and there's a person there?
No, in Accra, you would go to the trade hub.
And that's an office.
That's an
called
office.
U.S. Trade Hub.
It's a dedicated office. And in Nairobi, it's a dedicated office. And in Botswana, it's
And there's a
dedicated.
person in there who, if I want to go in and I want to start a business, I don't know, manufacturing houses, modular houses.
No, they would not be able to help you with that because their charter to now has just been to help African companies export to the U.S. under AGOA. To understand how to build houses there, you would have to go to the Commerce Department or the Commerce official in Nairobi, South Africa.
So I don't go to that I go back to the embassy?
Yeah, you go back to the embassy. So what I'm saying is that we need to harmonize
Right.
this stuff. We need a one-stop shop. We're talking about
Right.
one-stop border posts.
Right.
We need a one-stop shop for U.S. trade facilitation and investment facilitation.
And so
in
I
Africa.
go to this trade hub, this office, and who monitors the contract that I have? I'm running the trade hub now. Who's
Right.
monitoring me to make sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do?
USAID is.
And am I obligated to produce what? Am I obligated to have, 20 businesses from the U.S. do business on the continent, or what's the measurement?
Well, again, helping U.S. business is not part of the mandate
Oh, I'm
of the
sorry.
trade hubs.
Okay, the reverse.
But yes, I mean, I think they want to look at, well, for instance, in the West Africa Trade Hub, which clearly has helped helped African companies export to the U.S., there would be indicators there. I think the Southern Africa Trade Hub has really focused on regional integration. So I'm sure they're measured against a set of criteria that determines whether or not that's been achieved.
Do you know what the average size of a contract would be? If I'm running a trade hub, how much money do I get from you?
I'm sure you get a couple $1 million to do that.
Ooh.
And I'm sure that there are about 10 or 20, 10, 15 people that are working under that contract in that trade hub to do that.
So would you support the idea, when you're talking about that a better investment needs to be made, would you support the idea of expanding the number of trade hubs that we have?
I would support the idea of using, sort of building on the West Africa model, of using those trade hubs in Accra, for example, to start interacting with Cote d'Ivoire, to start interacting with Dakar, to start interacting with Ouagadougou. Nigeria is a little bit of a separate issue, but I think we should use those trade hubs to really be catalysts for regional trade and investment. And I think we need to approach our increased commercial engagement from a regional point of view as opposed just to a country point of view.
Well, it seems like a regional point of view, but it also seems like we need to have, like you said, commerce there. I mean, if they can only do one thing, which is to help export to the U.S., it seems like we would want, I mean, who facilitates U.S. businesses doing business on the continent? That's commerce.
Right. So I think in these trade hubs, it really needs to be not only the USAID contractors, but commerce, as well as representatives from EXIM, from TDA, from OPEC. So all our commercial agencies are working together. So you do have a whole of government approach, because now we sort of have a no government approach.
Right.
And I think that's really what we have to change.
And are there reports online that I could see to see what the 3 trade hubs have done? Or, I mean, I understand you said they report to USAID, but can I find out?
I mean, each of the trade hubs has websites. Each of the trade hubs do quarterly reports.
I looked at the website.
Yeah. So,
I
but
didn't see much there.
I have not.
Okay.
I would welcome a joint investigation for.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we at Brookings could help you do that. A fuller assessment, because I think it's essential to do as we move into this AGOA review period, so we can make these recommendations to understand what's being done successfully and what needs to be done better.
And I do know that USAID is looking at
Yes.
these trade hubs and what to do. Thank you.
But I think USAID needs to know that we're looking at them looking at that.
Yes, yes, we will make sure they know.
Thank you.
Dr. Landy, you talked about XM and MS and MCC special purpose vehicles, and I wanted to know if you could explain what you meant by that. You also talked about a potential sense of Congress. First of all, I appreciate you making the comparison with economic integration in Europe and talking about how long that took. I think that's really important that we manage our own expectations. So could you elaborate on those 2 points? You're not on.
I'm happy to elaborate, but only within my knowledge, more of as trade man. There are many people who really are experts on financing and so on, and I'm thinking of Mr. Pittmanoff, one name who's very active in this work, and I think we can get you a better answer than I'm going to give. But the way I understand it is that the World Bank has funds, and you need to develop some kind of special purpose vehicle, because you can't count on sovereign guarantees if you're building a project whose profit depends on the operations in more than one country. So you develop these special purpose vehicles with the World Bank, perhaps with U.S. financial institutions and so on, and perhaps now with venture capital funds, as you know, sovereign wealth funds. So without going too much over my head, the only point I would make is that very often the restrictions on Export-Import Bank, MCC, does not allow them to go into these new areas, because their emphasis is always, we want to have a 1% fail rate. We don't want to go to Congress if we have a 3% fail rate. But if you're going to be competitive in Africa, I think you very much have to mention that. With MCC, I think it's a decision that Congress has to make, because people work within congressional guidelines. I mean, they just don't decide. And I have 2 problems with our attitude towards MCC. One is, there is a need for U.S. involvement in infrastructure development in Africa, which may not only be in, quote, those very good countries who can qualify.
Right.
It's in the U.S. commercial interest, and it's in Africa's interest. We should have a very active infrastructure program in Angola. I'm not saying they're going to be MCC eligible, so there has to be some thinking whether we want our whole infrastructure effort to be through MCC. And then when you focus on relieving poverty, you have this debate. Should I spend money on these local rural roads, which are important, feeder roads that enable farmers to get their products to markets? Or should I be focusing on these transcontinental development corridors, which really, again, MCC, they have poverty. I mean, it's nothing wrong with fighting poverty, let me be clear. But that should not be our only limitation. And two, of course, is this national guideline. So they don't have an ability where a rec can come and say, hey, look at everything we've done. So maybe in drawing up and considering MCC, maybe you should say, okay, we'll come up with some rec guidelines that will enable you to go across the border. So I would make that point.
Another statement you made in terms of us holding countries accountable to AGOA standards, good governance and all, I think you said that you thought that the recs should be responsible as opposed to us holding individual governments. Did you say that?
Yes, and
So,
let me,
yeah, maybe you could give an example, especially considering how we have sanctioned some countries or pulled them out of AGOA.
let me take a step back because we discussed this. We discussed it the last time I appeared before your committee,
Okay.
and I think you asked me a question. I'm not sure. I think I was a little remiss not getting back. The idea that every time there's a problem, you should devise a sanction to deal with it,
Right.
and make that sanction a trade sanction has a problem. Because no one is going to get up, no U.S. company is going to get up and say, I believe in conflict minerals, I believe in gender inequality. I mean, it's not going to happen. So what we were thinking at Manchester Trade, and let me just put this idea out on the table, that the way, and I'm going to get to the peer pressure in a moment, the way you deal with sanctions, you come up with some guidelines, maybe out of this committee. And you say, first, you have to say, what is the problem, okay? Secondly, what impact does the U.S. have in solving this problem alone? Is it effective? What is the collateral damage? What effect does it have on local groups, particularly women? We took the sanction in Madagascar. I think Madagascar is returning to democracy now, but for 12 years, women have been out of work.
Right.
I mean, what have we accomplished? So we have to look at the collateral damage, both to U.S. competitiveness. If China keeps on working, keeps on trading, it doesn't help anybody except it harms U.S. workers who want to supply products there and so on, et cetera. So what we're basically suggesting is that one of the ingredients, in addition to the ones I mentioned, is let's talk to our African partners. Africa has a way of punishing people who have what they call, quote, aberrant behavior. I think that's always a cute term, aberrant behavior. But where they say, I'm sorry, you can't come to our next meeting. You can't share in our next decisions we're making on our development programs. You're out. They do not take economic sanctions because their argument is that affects somebody who's working in the fields. I mean, that's not what we want to do, but they have their own program. So if they're willing to, COMESA isn't set up so much. SADC and ECOWAS has much more of a political thing, so they can be more effective. But I would say that if Congress works on good guidelines for these messages to be taken, and if we begin to talk to the regional communities and say, yes, can you picture, we're going to designate all the COMESA members eligible. We want to do that. We want to have this intertrade. COMESA, these are our problems. Can you talk to your member states and see whether you could deal with them? Let me just simply say that I think that that's so much more effective than the current, what I call the feel good. Do you know we took Niger off of AGOA, and then we put it back on? In the meantime, what was going on was probably worse in terms of the government. We took the Congo off. I don't think the Congo even knew they were off, but they did know when a U.S. businessman came in to do business that they were mad at us and so on. And we know the Madagascar example because I've stated that, you know, it's been going on forever, and at the end of the day, we'll put them back on. So the only issue which I really say is that given the responsibility of your committee, I think this could be one particular area that you might be able to work on very nicely.
And maybe Dr. Sai and Cadre could respond to that as well. So, you know, our approach right now, if a country has had a coup or whatever, we'll pull them out of AGOA. What do you think, how do you think it should be handled? Maybe both of you could respond quickly. And then I'm done, sorry.
No.
Well, I think it's a matter of basically who will bear the brunt of the sanctions. An alternative is if you have the sanctions, to find a way to still address the needs of the most vulnerable segments of the society. You could still have humanitarian aid targeted and have the sanctions at the same time. So there are a variety of ways to go. And I think it's a matter, in any case, of having in mind the cost, the burden on the most vulnerable segments of society. If I may, it's like subsidies. Right now, for example, there's a lot of push to remove subsidies in many countries on oil because they benefit mostly the rich, but the problem is then how to target the subsidies to the poorer segments. So the analogy is useful.
Yeah, I would want to add that when there is a coup and you want to punish, perhaps you use the regional economic communities to restore good governance. There could be peer pressure, which sometimes works better than some of these trade sanctions, which might have serious repercussions on women and many other people. Thank you.
Thanks for making the copies available of the report. I yield.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. I want to change the tone a little bit and change the direction in which we're traveling here. And I like what you had to say about what we need to do to increase a relationship with the continent of Africa, the countries within the continent. But I have some significant and severe concerns about Iran, China, and to a lesser extent, Russia doing business on the continent of Africa. Now, I don't think anyone has touched on that yet, and I'd like to hear some insight from you. I'm going to just pose some factual information that I've been, China and the Middle East have always been a study of mine. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I am aware of, through my readings over the years, what takes place. So, for example, Iran is the second largest oil producer in OPEC. Even though on the continent it has supplies of oil, it still needs the byproducts from oil, it needs refineries, and it still needs oil to a certain extent. What does Iran get in return? Well, first of all, a trading partner with no sanctions. Iran gets uranium, and we all know what that issue sets in the future for us. They want ores from Africa, and Iran tries very hard and continues to build that relationship with the countries within the continent of Africa. China on a larger scale. China invests billions and billions of dollars in Africa. The Chinese call Africa the galloping lion. They know what resources are available there. Chinese give Africa money, in addition to very, very soft and low-cost loans for billions of dollars. The Chinese government builds refineries. The biggest investment in, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Baganmoya, a big investment there. Chinese need in return food, energy, natural resources, and even negotiate for some fishing rights. They build hospitals. They build schools. China is the largest investor in South Sudan by far, using billions of US dollars. Not using the yuan, using US dollars. Now, Africa has 40% of the global reserves of natural resources. 40%. 60% of unused farmland, and a plethora of low-wage workers. China is building 3 oil refineries in Nigeria and China, and China will cover 80% of the cost of that. There's a great deal of corruption that is taking place. There are even investigations and accusations about high-ranking officials in Africa taking millions of dollars from China. So my simple question is based on these facts, and if you want me to cite, I will later on if you request it, where I get these facts. What do we do about China and Iran? How do we persuade the countries within the continent of Africa to do business with us when pretty much because of regulations internationally and that we have, our hands are tied, and China walks in with virtually no debt, tons of money, and helps a country that is so, a continent that is so poverty-stricken for the most part, at virtually no cost to those countries. How do you defeat that? And gentlemen, if anyone's willing to make a statement on my little dissertation here, jump in.
So if I may, maybe I can look at this question through the angle of how regional economic communities can also help. But through our conversations with many businessmen, and we just had the CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on Africa just yesterday, it seems that the biggest advantage that China has over the U.S. is speed. That the Chinese companies and the Chinese government can deliver very quickly what Africa is asking right now. And sometimes it can have long-term costs.
Of course, because China doesn't care about its environment.
Yes, for example, but it's so if you are a minister right now and your country is facing severe power outages, and you know that elections are coming up and you have people in the street, well, the cheapest and the quickest way to have a power plant is to use coal, and the Chinese can do that very quickly. Yeah. If you were to deal with the US companies, it will take you a much longer time, and it's a more complicated process. So that's one advantage I think that other countries have to keep in mind when they look at China in Africa: speed. How do you really compete with the speed that China has? But this said, coming to how regional economic communities can help in the area of governance, integration again creates some common institutions that can help improve economic governance. They have convergence criteria, they have fiscal targets, and they have peer political governance. They have these peer reviews and so on. So one way would be really to strengthen these common regional institutions to really put basically the pressure on the countries to really have in mind the benefits of their citizens and go exactly like the EU and so on. The other one is also you're having lots of countries discovering oil. Oil discoveries are increasing, but also regional infrastructure, and maybe that's one way also to approach the problem with China, is to think about regional infrastructure rather than these bilateral projects are needed. Like if you are South Sudan, you need pipelines to sell your oil, and the pipelines go through Sudan, or there's this project to go through Kenya. So again, that's this regional infrastructure. That's one way to see the problem and address the problems.
Okay, my time's limited, and I just wanted to see if anyone else wanted to respond to it. Please go ahead.
Let me respond if I can. On the Chinese side, let me start with your last question. What can we do to get U.S. business there? I mean, the reality is that the U.S. doesn't show up to do business in Africa, which has created a vacuum. And that's problem number one. But if you went to any African government and said, who would you rather do business with? There's no question they'd rather do business with a U.S. company. Why? Number one, we're going to hire local people, we're going to train local people, we're going to create jobs, we're going to invest in communities, we're going to have clear, transparent deals. And that's the big difference. So I think, from my point of view, the big problem with China is not so much their presence. It's the nature of their presence. Chinese come, they bring their own workers, they don't train anybody, they stick to themselves, and that's a problem.
Point we're taking. We have 7 minutes to get over there and vote, and if you can be very brief, sir. Your microphone.
The U.S. has many advantages in terms of working, and I won't go beyond that. The school, the reputation, U.S. goods mean a lot, and so on. We don't have the problems. However, having said that, your question is absolutely the correct one. But the answer isn't to say only what should China do. I think it behooves the Congress to sit down and to say, why do we take so long to approve our Export-Import Bank? I remember a discussion about a year ago before the rechartering of the bank, and they have Mr. Angevine, they have a very dedicated person and working in Africa Export, he quadrupled their loan, beautiful job. But during our discussion, we said, can you create some special facilities? Oh no, we can't change the charter. Oh no, the charter's in place. God forbid we touch it. And in fact, a lot of people think Export-Import Bank is a form of corporate welfare. So what I'm saying to you and my response is, and I'd love to have more time to discuss with you and so on, I can go through 7 different things the U.S. can do if Congress would give more flexibility to the agencies, risking perhaps some problems, but will better enable us to compete against China. But our real answer is exactly what was just said by Whitney, and that is we have to be what we are. High-quality people, but there are things, and I'm assuming the responsibilities with Congress as well as with other people. Thank you.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you very much. Let me try to be very quick. I think we have 2 issues here, an issue of speed versus ensuring good economic and political governance. China comes with a speed in delivery, but then issues about governance, environment, etc. is challenged. What we need to do is to strike a good balance by ensuring that we bring the USA and the other OECD countries, bring China to the negotiation table. There's been some initiatives in the aid effectiveness debates and the rest to bring China to negotiation table and ensure that some of these issues are streamlined, and I hope we pursue that line of action. Thank you.
I wish we could continue this. We could be here for several hours on that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Moreno. Let me just conclude. I do have one final question, and perhaps we will run out of time. But, in monitoring the AGOA, it has become clear that national labor protection systems are often weak or non-existent. And I'm wondering how you might recommend that the regional economic communities address the need to establish and enforce standards to protect the rights and health of workers. I would note parenthetically that a couple of years ago, I was part of an effort to cite China and its unfair trading practice in terms of exploitation of its labor force. And USTR never took it up. We've been trying to get them to take something up ever since. But when they pay 10 to 50 cents per hour, there's no OSHA regulations, 130,000 people plus die every year on the job in China. All these egregious practices are engaged in, employed by so many factories in China. And with China's ascendancy economically in Africa, those bad practices, just like bad governance practices, the use of secret police and the like, could easily, for a dictatorship, become very attractive. But how do we make sure that as this regional cooperation effort gets further underway, that these ILO-type standards, OSHA-type standards, they don't have to be exactly like the U.S. or whatever, but something that really protects people on the job, health and safety. It's something I think we should build into it. We do to some extent, but I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that.
Mr. Chairman, I agree completely. I think this really has to be part of our bilateral dialogue with the AGOA beneficiary governments. And I think it has to be part of our embassy going out and monitoring what is happening in these factories. I would like to think that there's some resources to invest in training and showing examples, helping business leaders from the region come to the U.S. perhaps and see what good standards are all about and how they can be replicated at home. And I think we have to take a proactive approach to this and not see it as punitive, but see it as something that's going to enhance productivity.
I appreciate that. I would also include, because it would come under the rubric of health, but environmental standards. I mean, I remember in New Jersey when, I grew up right near Woodbridge, Island. I woke up with Chevron smoke in my house pretty much, and that effluent, that smell, we didn't know what clean air was. And, we would hate to see that replicated because we know what it does in terms of health of not just the workers. My father-in-law worked in DuPont and died of leukemia. He was around resins, and so there are huge downsides health-wise that if you get the environmental piece right, as more factories build up, it could be an enormous positive for the Africans. Yes. Mr. Landay.
3 very quick points. Well, 1 quick comment. I don't know if Woodbridge is near exit 9 on the New Jersey Turnpike. But
Exit 11.
thank you. My wife knows it very well, and she shares
What
with
exit?
you. She puts a mask on when she goes there. But seriously, 1, the whole idea of moving away from unilateral sanctions, because that's what's in our bill now, and working with the regional economic communities, working on the ILO standards. Fortunately, Africa has not had the problems that we've seen in Bangladesh, have not had the problems we've seen in China. A lot has to do with the fact, particularly in the former British colonies, that there's a lot already in place. So my view is, if you work with them, if U.S. unions would be willing to participate, as they have particularly in Latin America, to develop these standards and so on, I think it works. But it does not work if it's done, punitively. We're going to save the worker by taking away his job. Well, that doesn't work. Obviously, you have to be clever at that. So that's kind of my very short comment, that you should look at modifying the conditions, but really work with them in the context. And this could be a perfectly good job for the trade hubs. The administration is already committed to involve commerce in trade hubs. That's already in their position. Let's get labor involved, too. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Well, I would just maybe broaden the debate and say that this is also one important element of good corporate governance practices. And in Africa also, if you are a business, it's very difficult to avoid the government as a customer, as a partner. So the issue of corporate governance and public governance together is something that should be pursued, because at the end of the day, it's good business and it's good for everybody.
Thank you. Dr. Corti.
It's a quick one. I would want to add that we need to harmonize labor standards and laws within the regional economic communities. That would ensure that some of these unfair practices are minimized. Thank you.
Thank you. We are out of time because there is a vote on the floor. We're down to 30 seconds or so, I'm told. So I thank you so much for your testimony, for your insights, and please feel, pick up the phone, send us an email if there's something you think we should be doing. You've made excellent recommendations, and we will act upon them. Thank you so much. The hearing is adjourned.